Well, I'm happy to support the resolution that meditation should be taught in schools. This is an interesting resolution because I'm very familiar with the topic of meditation. I practiced it for the past 2 years, and whenever I enter into a conversation about it with someone, I want to be sure to distinguish it from the stereotype. You don't have to be some Tibetan monk floating on a mountaintop to practice meditation anymore. It's not just some purely religious practice. Rather, meditation has become something broader that's integral to human health and wellness. So when we define meditation, let's offer a definition that offers that sort of clarity. I'm going to define meditation as a set of breathing techniques and cognitive tools that detach you from anxiety and promote self-awareness. Now, of course, there's some diversity within meditation, but primarily what we're going to be focusing on are the non-religious uses of meditation that focus on slowing your breathing, being aware of your emotions, not judging them per se, but just being willing to observe them. These build self-awareness and are, profoundly healthy. So the first question we have to ask for this motion is, what kind of stuff should schools be teaching? And that's why I offer the standard of personal excellence, which is defined as the goal of education as to give students the skills and knowledge they need to live the best life possible. Now, school is oriented around giving students important life skills. And, if meditation were just some side venture that didn't really matter, it was just some fun thing to know about, that would be one thing. But meditation is actually profoundly helpful. It improves behavior and it makes life easier for other people involved. I want to briefly just give a psychological explanation of what actually happens when you meditate, because it's not just smoke and mirrors and, a magic wand, slaps down and then magic, you feel all better, immediately. That's not really what's happening, of course. When you meditate, and scientists at the Scientific American have been studying this for decades. Meditation as a practice has been rigorously studied by different organizations. What's really happening is your prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain associated with higher decision-making, control, and organization, actually thickens over time. And the amygdala, the part of your brain that's responsible for stressful responses with fear and emotion, actually ends up shrinking and becoming far more controllable. So with the psychological analysis out of the way, let's see what the results actually say. I'm going to offer two main arguments. The first is that it promotes healthy behavior, and the second is that it emotionally betters children. Now, the Quiet Time program is actually an example of the resolution. The Quiet Time program is a research program developed by the University of Chicago Crime Lab. It's been instituting, two 15-minute periods of meditation within metropolitan Chicago public schools. What they found is over the past 2 years, there's been an 86% reduction in suspensions, also a 65% decrease in violent conflict over the 2 years. Another school in Baltimore has found similar success. They've seen fewer suspensions when they use meditation to combat aggression and misbehavior instead of a stern warning or yelling or more conflict. Meditation actually helps you make better decisions because it controls your emotions. This is what will lead on to the second argument. Now, there's only been 2 major studies on meditation offered to kindergarten students, and both of them have been completely positive. This is from the medical journal Early Education and Development, volume 27, issue 6 in 2016. They noted that there were notable improvements in self-regulation and working memory because children were able to control their emotions and be smart.
All right, everyone, welcome to the semi-finals. So first thing I'm going to do in this debate, I'm going to agree with Joe's definition. It seems that is what meditation is. I'm going to try and change the victory condition for him. He says that he merely needs to show that it contributes to a standard of excellence, but I think this is not true, because in schools, there are lots of things which can contribute to a standard of excellence, but schools are about picking the best out of the available options. For example, if the resolution was that all the great works of Shakespeare should be taught in schools, I would have a hard time learning great works of Shakespeare wouldn't contribute to the standards of excellence, but you'd probably still vote against the motion because you just know that you cannot possibly fit all of them in. It is my argument, my case in this debate, that meditation has not been proven to work to agree, which is significant. And when put in competition with other very relevant things which schools need to be spending money on, keeping in mind that schools are organizations which are stretched to the financial limit, where teachers are often underpaid, where many schools do not have the resources to even put textbooks in front of their children, spending money training teachers to meditate is a total waste of time. So with that, I've got one positive piece of material to advance, which will directly clash with my opponent so far. That is, meditation has not been proven to work. My opponent references 2 studies. The first thing I'm going to note is that the first study was not a study of meditation in school. It was a study of personal meditation more generally. And the second study appeared to be talking about not meditation as a teaching tool for students in general, but more as a disciplinary tool for particular problem students. So, for example, he used the language of meditation as opposed to a stern warning, which infers that this is a student who is already in trouble. I am totally okay with meditation being used as a disciplinary tool, but I'm not okay as it being used as a regular thing which is taught to all students. What I would like to offer is a counter study, which I'm going to prove is better than his study. My study is a meta-analysis, which means that it is taking the combined results of 75 different studies. Well, I'm going to offer a few quotes from that study in order to illustrate what I think the truth of the matter is. The first thing the studies notes is that of the 76 studies it takes into account, only 61 had effect sizes which were significant, statistically significant. Of those, 67% had small effects on student outcomes, 24 had medium effects, and 9% had large effects on student outcomes. Another quote from this study is one such as, "Given the small number of studies, lack of measurement information, e.g. reliability, and differences in measurement and construct property, we were unable to analytically combine effect sizes to run moderator analysis." The reality is that when it comes to this stuff being studied in school, the studies are in their infant stages, and only 9% basically, which ended up reporting statistically significant effect sizes, proved that there was actually significant result in students. I have no doubt that maybe meditation might marginally work for some students, but that is not the standard my opponent needs to meet. He needs to meet it when compared to other spending priorities, which when later in my case I will show are far more reliable and far more urgent rather than just meditation. With that, I'll pass it back to Joe.
Wait, so where was your meta-analysis from? That's the mic. Where was your meta-analysis from?
Look, I'm just going to grab I've got the link. So I'm just scrolling up. Okay, it's a study by Lee Waters, Adam Barsky, Amanda Riss, and Kelly Allen. It's an open review article from the Educational Psychology Review called Contemplative Education, a systemic evidence-based review of effective meditation interventions in schools.
What year was that?
2015.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so there's a couple things I want to say to my opponent. Okay, so the first thing he says is, well, this this hasn't been proven, so really, we can't really make any sort of assessment of meditation because we haven't. I want to pull a quote together from Oren J. Sofer, who's the senior program manager at Mindful Schools. Here's the thing: like we have this obsession. I think an obsession with data is healthy, and I think as more data comes out, it's only going to validate the fact that meditation is good. But I don't think the conclusion to this is that we shouldn't teach meditation in schools just because there hasn't been overwhelming evidence that it is. For example, if there were competing evidence, one side saying it's actually really harmful and dangerous, and the other side saying it's actually really positive, he'd have a point. But where's the risk? Where's the actual tangible problems that we see when meditation is being taught? He's just complaining and saying, well, we haven't had all the evidence in the world, and that's because of a lack of studies, not because of actual negative studies that have proven that it's bad. This is what he says: you can overstate the research and make claims that haven't been validated, which is true. People can do that. But saying that it's experimental is understating the research. I think it's important to research this stuff, but we have to have common sense. Do we as adults and educators in society have a responsibility to teach children to be self-aware? You don't need a research study to answer that question. And that's really the thesis that I come back to. Your decision in this resolution is not difficult because there isn't risk to voting affirmative. You're not going to suddenly start killing children left and right or traumatizing them invariably. This is teaching them self-awareness and emotional realization. Okay, so let's sit down on his arguments. First, he responds in saying, my first study wasn't in schools. Doesn't matter. It's still on children. And the cognitive effects of meditation don't magically become negative when you pull them out. So at the first point that he's conceding that there have been noticeable and demonstrated statistical results of meditation that are positive, he can't come back and say that they're negative. He can't even come back and say that they're even. Because while meditation may not, always maximize the positivity of people, there's another study that talks about how meditation is just particular for people that have been through traumatic. If your life's already really amazing, you're not going to notice a big difference. That isn't a reason to vote negative. He's just saying, well, it's not going to change everything in the world, so we might as well vote neg, but that's not really a good argument. He has to show why it's negative or somehow better to vote negative, and he hasn't done that. The second thing he says is it's disciplinary. My response is, well, this actually deters the problem. If you're going to teach it regularly, and if you're going to use it as a disciplinary response, that is teaching it in schools. You can't teach meditation in schools, even if it's for disciplinary action when you vote negative, so you don't get access to the argument that you're actually deterring these things. So jump into the statistics where we actually see an 86% reduction in suspensions, 65% decrease in violent conflict. These are tangible positive goods. My opponent is actually going to have to outweigh these. He's going to have to show that there are substantive benefits that outweigh these reductions in aggression and violence when you vote for him. The last thing is the standard. So my opponent says, well, we can't teach everything that's personally excellent to children, and I agree. So what more personally excellent stuff do we have to teach that must replace meditation? Meditation, the study this too, required 2 15-minute periods a day and saw an 86% reduction in suspensions and violence. I think that that's substantial, and I think that's worth the time.
So the first thing I'd like to say is that he says, where is the risk? Well, the risk is, I told you at the beginning. When you're talking about inserting things into an already overcrowded school curriculum and schools with already limited funds, the risk is that you are taking away from things which need that funding and need that time more. two 15-minute periods a day, when you take into account moving the kids into the classroom where they need to meditate, settling them down, et cetera, et cetera. Like, I've worked in a school. That's actually a significant portion of the kid's day. That is like nearly 10 to 20% of their total school education. So the risk is not that meditation will cause kids to start killing each other. It's that it will deprive kids of things which they would otherwise need more. And you can, for example, notice there's a well-known correlation between, for example, learning a musical instrument and increasing your ability in math. But that doesn't mean that we would make learning a musical instrument compulsory and something we spend a lot of school time on, right? Because the correlation is there, but it's not overwhelmingly positive, that it is more positive than just spending more time doing math class. And that is what this thing is about. The next thing, look, he says studies aren't relevant, but then quotes a bunch of studies to support his argument, which is a bit mutually contradictory. Then he says on my disciplinary point, his points about violent reduction, the reason which his statistics are so significant is because the study is selecting for kids who are already predisposed to violence, right? So you can't get an 80% violent reduction in a kid who doesn't do any violent stuff, right? Which is why I'm happy for meditation to be used as a disciplinary tool. And I think his study supports that very well. It does not support you teaching meditation to kids writ large at the expense of their other studies. My next positive point will be about how teaching meditation, particularly in a school environment, is likely to make meditation worse. Many of the studies, if you read the methodology, use small groups of children. You can tell, for example, the way which my opponent is talking about, right, with small groups of truanting kids. That's easy because you've got one specialized meditation teacher with a small group of children who do not need as much class control. What does this look like in the actual school context? There's a few. One, teachers are not yoga instructors. They will require additional training, which will likely be either A, unpaid, or B, at the expense of other professional development, which could help them teach the subject which they're actually there to teach better. Two, school kids, there are always some of them who are class clowns and little shits, and it only takes one of them to bring an entire class down, especially when you're talking about something like meditation, when it's silent, when everyone's trying to concentrate, when people are trying to be free from distractions. It only takes one kid to make a bunch of noise, or for the teacher have to engage in behavior control to undermine the value of that for everyone. And size matters here, because the bigger the class, it only takes one rotten egg to spoil it for everyone. And the bigger the class, it's going to be harder to do behavior controls. Kids also just do things in school like show up late for class, right? Because they missed their bus or their parents were busy for work, which means that you're going to have kids making excuses, walking with notes in the middle of a meditation session and ruining it for everyone as well, completely innocently. There's also a novelty problem here. Often, a lot of time these studies succeed is because they're not longitudinal. Kids often get off on things which are like kind of different, maybe for the first week, but after a whole month of doing 15 minutes of sitting down and doing nothing, right, a lot of these kids start to just muck up, which is why, for example, like I've done prac teaching stuff, and kids always take a shine to the prac teacher for the first week. They always like the things you got to do, but after weeks 2 or 3, they start to go back to their old habits of muck.
Okay, so the first thing is he says, well, there's some things that are beneficial and yet we still don't teach it. I absolutely think that kids should learn music. That's why it's a class that's taught in school. Are we suggesting we remove all musical instruments? Of course not. My second response is this is only 15 minutes. You can see the argument where we're talking about the time impact is extremely minimal. It's only 2 15-minute periods a day. You could even reasonably knock that down to 1 15-minute period and still see some marginal success. He's not proving, like he can't just say, well, there's money involved, so you obviously have to vote neg. Unless he can find something that is literally more valuable for the 2 15-minute periods in meditation, he's not winning. He's not giving you a reason to prefer his side. He's just trying to find some sort of criticism and say, well, there could be an edit here or there, but that's not sufficient to say that we shouldn't teach it. Okay, the second thing he says, only bad kids, this is only really affecting them. My first response is that's still a massive impact. Okay, we're going to turn this analysis. Look over to issues like cyberbullying and aggression in schools, things that traumatize children at a young age, if not increase rates of suicide, depression, and anxiety among other children. If you actually do solve these problems for bad kids early on, that's a massive impact. He's trying to mitigate and say, well, it's only bad kids. There are plenty of bad kids in school that need this sort of help. Since when has it become an argument to say, well, we're only reducing aggression and violence because the bad children are doing it, so obviously that doesn't matter. That makes no sense. Aggression and violence comes from bad kids who, guess what, don't want to behave badly, emotionally aware. Listen, you get no solution to those kinds of problems when you vote negative. You get nothing positive. He's going to criticize and say, well, statistically, it's not perfect for everyone. And, well, maybe it costs a little bit more money. Or maybe, in one case, it could go wrong somewhere, but he's not actually concluding that we shouldn't teach it. He's not actually concluding that you should vote negative. Okay, the second response is you can't use it that education. Now, he's actually trying to concede my analysis and say, well, the disciplinary action I actually support. You can't use meditation as a disciplinary action if the kids have never learned it to begin with. This turns his whole argument. It's impossible to use meditation. You can't say so to someone who's like never done meditation before once they misbehave. All right, Johnny, I know you've never even learned this word, but go meditate. That's why they teach it to begin with. That's why the entire institution that I mentioned has been successful. quiet time. So let's move on to the third argument. He says, well, he basically presents a bunch of ways that this might go wrong. The overarching response is that these arguments don't matter. I mean, I could say, well, we shouldn't teach history in school because what if you got someone who wasn't trained? What if you got someone who, and this actually literally happened, like in some Kentucky school, said that African slaves were actually just workers and not real slaves. Like, of course, there's ways for it to go wrong, but we don't conclude and say that history shouldn't be taught. We just say, well, we assume that by the normal means it'll be taught by professionals. So my first response is look at quiet time. Look, this nixes out all of the disadvantages he's giving you because we haven't seen the disadvantages within the status quo. We haven't seen that it's been exorbitantly expensive and not worth the money that it gives us. I would say that the money is worth reducing things like aggression because those are practical impacts. My second response is teach by experts. You know, quiet time, the people that go through this program regularly practice mindfulness. They know what they're talking about. They're going to teach it. So you're not going to just vote con because maybe it is hypothetically possible to, you know, support the resolution in a way that's problematic. Of course, experts will be teaching.
Okay, first thing. So my opponent says that I haven't really shown a significant cost, but the cost is obvious, right? It's the time cost, right? Half an hour a day is like 20% of a kid's contact hours a day. That's a lot of school day missing. Second thing, he says that, well, 15 minutes will do. You can't assert that. That's just something you said as an excuse. The next thing he said was that, oh, well, with the disciplinary stuff, it can't be used retrospectively because once the kids misbehave, they're a lost cause. But your study is using it retrospectively. It's not like they entered a bunch of good kids. The language of your study is that it was used as an alternative to discipline. There's nothing on my side which precludes me from allowing meditation as a specific targeted disciplinary practice. What I'm saying is it shouldn't be taught to kids writ large in schools. Next thing you said was that, well, it'll be taught by professionals and, quote, we haven't seen it gone wrong in the status quo. Well, here's a problem with that. It hasn't been on a wide scale in the status quo. The status quo is researchers funding it themselves on a very small scale because they're trying to get results. What you're proposing is that this is implemented to every school, which means that the government will have to fund it. Or if they're not funding it, I doubt the researchers are going to fund the entire, like, you know, professional yoga instructors or whatever for the entire bloody nation. That's not going to happen, which means that that money will have to be taken out of the education budget somewhere else. And what are we losing? Which leads me to our last constructive point. What are the better ways we could be spending this money in ways which are actually proven to work? There's a few programs which we really know do work. All go to kids who need it more. First of all, teacher pay. Teachers chronically underpaid hours, and the result of that is that many of the best and brightest people who could be good in profession because they have opportunities and they will go elsewhere. By pouring more money instead of into meditation people who only do half an hour contact with schools, to send it to teachers will incentivize better teachers, which will lead to increased student results. Second thing, breakfast clubs. One of the sad realities, unfortunately, is that lots of kids who come from broken and troubled homes have trouble in school, not because they're not smart, because they haven't eaten since 9 p.m. the night before. What schools really should be doing is doing targeted programs like breakfast clubs, which spending that money, which would be spent on yoga instructors, to feed children so that they're nourished and able to concentrate in class. Third thing, resources. There are many schools who only have textbooks from a decade ago, who have so little Bunsen are crowded 8 around a single one. What this means is that it lowers the educational quality for kids all writ large, and also particularly punishes children who come from low SES backgrounds and schools. See, for example, Detroit, where there are literally rats living in the walls. I would much rather take all this meditation money and make it so that kids aren't, at the risk of catching rabies when they go to school, rather than teaching them how to meditate. And lastly, teachers' aides. As someone who's taught in a school, let me tell you this: one of the biggest problems is that there are lots of kids who are reading and writing at the year 3 level when they're in year 7. And in that environment, one teacher, no matter how talented they are, can't do the job by themselves. They need teachers' aides, and there aren't enough of them. We need to hire more people to be in classrooms to allow that differentiated learning experience to help the kids who need it most, instead of just pouring money into these meditative practices, which, yes, will do some good results, but not as many as the alternative programs.
Okay, so once again, even if we assume the max of 2 15-minute periods, and one 15-minute period, by the way, is not arbitrary. Most of the meditative practices that I do are 10, maybe sometimes as much as 20 minutes, but never more, because it's not practically beneficial to do more than that. 15 is a mean average, which is a lot to do for kids, but we actually see that it works. So it's not that much time. You haven't proven how that 30 minutes is somehow the most essential 30 minutes of the day that's going to destroy the kids' lives unless they spend it on something else. You also haven't talked about what else they need to be spending it on. So you're creating a vague replacement disadvantage and saying, there has to be this other thing we spend our time on, or this 30 minutes matters so much, but you haven't proven why it matters so much. We've already seen that it's possible to implement with the quiet time program, and we've already seen that those 15 minutes are actually worth it. You keep ignoring the fact that reducing aggression and reducing stuff like violence in schools really matters. You don't walk to the argument that I give when I talk about cyberbullying and suicide rates, that this would actually most probably have an impact on that, because kids are better at emotionally regulating. Now, here's the thing. You say, well, this is only for kids that already had aggression, but here's the thing. We already see from the results of the quiet time program program that even for kids that didn't already behave violently, that they found themselves that they were better at emotional regulation, that they were better at stuff like interacting with other people, that it does have this holistic benefit for people in society. It's not random. It's not a guess. It's not a placebo pill that you take and hope that it interacts with your physiochemistry. That's not what's happening. It's beneficial for the mind. And unless you get back to that issue, unless you're really willing to say that meditation is random, barely works for half of people, and can be harmful, you don't really have reasons to vote for you. You just have mild criticisms of ways that it might go wrong. However, the net of meditation is that it is good. And unless you're willing to contest that, there's very few reasons to vote for you. Okay, he says, well, first, this would not really be at large. All of his examples aren't at large. Okay. Couple responses. My first response is the reason this is a circular argument for Ned, because he's saying, well, we haven't implemented it at large, so we don't know, so we better not implement it at large. Look, of course it hasn't been implemented at large. If it was, we couldn't be having the resolution as a suggestion of change because it would be inherent. Like that wouldn't make any sense. But what from the examples we do see of its practical implementation, like the school in Baltimore I mentioned in the opening speech, as well as the Quiet Time program in Chicago, where 97% of kids are low income, where many of the kids don't end up graduating or finding successful lives after school, we find that it does have these positive improvements. There is net tangible good when you vote pro, and there is nothing zilch when you vote neg. The second thing he says is, well, you know, I support discipline, but not teaching at large. You can't use the disciplinary method of meditation if they never learn to begin with. The second thing aggression, because emotional regulation kicks in. Kids never need to be violent to begin with, and you don't need disciplinary measure. So it has holistic benefits. Third, he says, well, you know, we'd be implementing this wide scale. My response is budget differently. The solution isn't to kick meditation out, but have the government spend money differently. Third thing, he gives a bunch of other random things that we could also do. I say I support all. Yes, teachers should be paid more. Yes, they should be given better benefits. I mean, U.S. government spends millions of dollars studying Peruvian basket weaving every year. We should siphon that money and use it towards stuff that really works, like meditation and teachers.
Okay, the reality is that my opponent does not have the fair power debate to restructure the entire United States budget. I think a much more fair interpretation, as it is in every state in the world, is that there is a limited education budget and we need to pick carefully where we put that money. There is never infinite of it, and there is definitely not infinite time. That is something you cannot reallocate from Peruvian basket weaving, which means that we need to be careful about where we pick. First question in this debate. Does meditation work? My opponent leans heavily on one particular study which targets kids from disadvantaged backgrounds who have a predisposition towards violence, and it shows that there are dramatic reductions in violence. I would suggest that nearly any specialized intervention on kids who are troubled like that will probably reduce violence. What this debate is about is whether it will be used effectively on kids writ large. The meta-analysis, right, which includes this study my opponent is talking about likely, and many, many others, shows that actually it is only in 9% of the 60% of cases which have statistically significant results that there is a significant effect, which means that yes, this is a net positive, but it's not as much of a net positive that you would displace things like class time, right, which actually work. You know, having kids in math class definitely teaches them math, right? Having them meditate in 9% of 60% maybe has a significant result. Second question, why is it that the school environment in particular is likely to make this worse? And this has not been responded to by my opponent. I said that one, you would have to train teachers in a way which they haven't been trained before, which would likely cost a lot of money or displace other time they had to, you know, do lesson plans and help their actual subjects. My opponent says we're going to hire professionals for every single school, which is obviously going to come at an absolutely intolerable cost. The second thing I said was that there are things just like kids showing up late, like class brats, and particularly as class sizes grow bigger, as they will need to, that will likely interrupt the effectiveness of the meditation. That got no response. The third thing I said is that there are other things we could put the money towards. And my opponent, like at the beginning, well, my opponent hasn't identified anything which actually matters, as if, you know, feeding kids adequate nourishment and making sure that there aren't rats tearing down the walls is not something which matters. Like, good luck. If anyone actually believes that, then you really don't deserve to be judging this debate. But at the end of the day, really, right, like, paying teachers more, buying more textbooks, getting more teachers aid, getting breakfast clubs is an expensive endeavor. And these things all really, really, really matter, right? Like, you know, there is no argument that when you've got a class, and trust me, I've been in these classes, these things exist on a large scale, where 3 or 4 of the kids are reading at a year 3 level and you're in year 8. They need someone on them all the time if they want to have a hope of keeping up. When you've got kids from foreign languages who need an interpreter with them all the time, in order for them to have a hope of keeping up. At the moment, we can't afford these things. And one of the reasons we can't afford them, unfortunately, is that more and more money is being spent on these harebrained ideas like medication, which sometimes help kids, but really don't help the kids who need it most in the most significant ways. I'll pass the mic.
2 years of analysis, 86% reduction in aggression, reduction in suspension, better emotional regulation, decades of research on the action of meditation doesn't make it or doesn't begin to qualify it as harebrained. My opponent is not offering you anything tangible when you vote for him. Okay, let's get down to the first thing. First thing is you can't restructure the budget. This is a hypothetical policy resolution. We're talking about what the government should do, and he's saying, well, we can't restructure the budget. What he's essentially saying is we don't have any money. We got to pretend that we don't have a dime to spend on any program. Two responses. My first response is nonprofit organizations. The David Lynch Foundation has actually funded the Quiet Time program. Schools have barely spent a dime implementing it. So if anything, meditation is a program that's so well funded by other organizations, we're probably going to be fine. Even if it did cost money, where's his argument that the government budget is so tightly drawn, we can't draw a dime to offer 2 15-minute periods of education? I mean, this is ridiculous. He would literally have to be pulling out briefs of evidence and saying, that's it, we ran out, we have the last dime covered, and we can't afford this. I'm not suggesting some trillion-dollar infrastructure plan. This is 2 15-minute periods of education that is already proven to work. He can't get past the fact that after his meta-analysis was done in 2015, that from 2015 to 2017, the 2 years that I've been analyzing, it's actually been successful and reduced violence. That is going to be the reason you vote AF. The second thing he says, well, we have to look at what teachers we train. My response is use experts. You always assume that when you're teaching a subject, you're going to be using people that are qualified. I say we should implement something like the Quiet Time program all around the US, because that would be an example. Remember, he can't say hypothetically there's a way that teaching history could go wrong. You get a crazy loon that doesn't really know what he's doing. We assume that for the sake of this resolution, when we say we should teach education in schools, meditation schools, we're not saying every possible way you could ever teach meditation is good, or even in most ways. There are a lot of ways to mess up history. There are a lot of ways to mess up economics. But when we say it should be taught, we're saying there is an example of a way that is good and should be supported, and that is worth doing. That's what I've already gotten to. Also, get past the arguments about showing up late. Students actually showed up late in the Quiet Time program, and it wasn't an issue. Students show up late in my yoga class at SMU. It's not actually a problem. He's not proving that someone showing up late is somehow a disadvantage that is worth the increased rates of regression and violence within communities. I mean, this is just a ridiculous editing disadvantage where he's saying it might go wrong, but he doesn't have good reason to believe that it will be worth the actual benefits lost from meditation. Last thing, do all of the other advantages. These aren't mutually exclusive counter plans. He's saying have them eat breakfast and pay teachers. These in no way are the trade-off between meditation and any of these other benefits. You can do more. So unless he's saying we can't afford to do meditation, which doesn't make sense because it's technically free if nonprofits afford it, and it's also worth the money, and it's also incredibly low cost because it's 2 15-minute periods, he doesn't have a good replacement here. So look, he's going to get up and say there's other things we could be spending our money on. Those don't matter. We can do those in addition. They don't make you believe that we shouldn't do meditation. No one says, well, eating breakfast, we must not do meditation. It works and it reduces violence. Thanks.
Okay, so first thing, is the opportunity cost argument which I'm propelling relevant? I would point you back to my initial intuition pump. If what the motion was that we should teach all the great works of Shakespeare, Joe would have the same arguments, right? They are good. They help kids holistic, literacy. There's the, expanding their imagination in terms of language, and that would all be true. But there isn't time to do all of that, is there? There isn't the money to give schools literally every book, right? So we have to make qualitative triage decisions about what is the best use of time and best use of money. My opponent says, well, there's basically infinite money. Well, it's like, well, no, actually, in the real world, there isn't, unfortunately, infinite money. My opponent says NGOs will fund it. Well, at the moment, they're funding it in what, 2 schools for your study on a small scale? Try every school in the country, and by your own analysis, hiring an expert in meditation for and also it can't be one expert in meditation, right? Unless you're going to pull kids out of class randomly. If you're going to have the whole school doing it at once, that's a lot of experts. And I'd also like to ask, are these experts in meditation trained in behavior control? Because I really want to know, when the class brat starts playing up, are they ready for that? There's more and more training and more money which needs to be spent. The next thing is that it's also, my opponent tries to play it down by like, oh, it's only 2 15-minute sessions. Yes, but it's 2 15-minute sessions in every school in the entire nation. That's how many people you would have to hire. And that also is a significant amount of time in the school environment. School only goes for a couple of hours. And when you factor in recess and lunch and moving kids around, those 2 15-minute sessions means that they're nearly missing an entire half of their allocated time for math or for English, right? That's time they can't spend actually learning things, right? That's a problem which you're going to have to reckon with. The second thing I told you, which you didn't really respond to very well, was that it's interrupted by the school environment. students show up late and students mess up. And my opponent says, well, in the quiet time program, they showed up late and it was all good. I just don't believe that that's what they put in the study. Like, what sort of study have you read? Which also has a footnote, by the way, a couple of kids showed up late, but oh, gee, right? Like, that's not the sort of details they put in studies. So either one, this wasn't a very controlled study because apparently kids were just walking in and out of the classroom and God knows where the control, what happened to the control group, or my opponent just making shit up on the spot to cover his ass, which is likely the situation. The last thing I told you was that there are other funding priorities which desperately need your help more. And really, my opponent has not done much other than say we can do those two, right? Like, when kids show up without adequate, kids are reading well beyond their level and need specialized attention, when kids don't understand the language very well and need an interpreter on them. These are things which schools currently can't afford under the current budget, and definitely can't afford if even more of that budget is being reallocated to meditation. Obviously, meditation might be a good thing. It might marginally increase students, feeling well, a self-reported result, but it's not the same as feeding kids who are starving.